to our first global speaker this morning, who's come all the way from New York. This world-renowned economist warned about the global meltdown way back in 2006, and he also got it right on the Trump era, marking a shift away from globalization to isolationism.
Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage one of the most authoritative voices in global economy and world markets, the man who is often called Dr. Doom and Perma Bear. Put your hands together for birthday boy Nouriel Roubini.
Happy birthday, Nouriel. Happy birthday.
We'll sing to you later.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, honorable senior policymakers, it's a great pleasure and honor being here this morning here in Delhi. I've been in Asia for the last 10 days, from Seoul to Tokyo to Beijing and Hong Kong. I come regularly to India, a vibrant economy and a vibrant democracy, and it's a great pleasure being back here again. I was earlier this year also in Delhi, Mumbai. I was asked to speak about what is the state of the global economy this year. What are the positives, the upsides, and what are, of course, the negatives and the downside risks. And I would say the following observation. There is a little bit of a paradox this year about the global economic outlook. And the paradox, the way I see it, is that in some dimensions, we may be in the best of all times, because on a cyclical side, there is a cyclical recovery and expansion, stronger than in previous years. And on the structural medium-long-term side, there are some trends in the global economy that are very positive, having to do with globalization, technology, and the rise of emerging markets. So in some dimensions, things are going much better today, both short-term and medium-long-term, than in previous years. But the paradox is that unless we address some of the risk, short-term, medium, and long-term, that might actually negatively affect the global economy, the best of all times may eventually become the worst of all times. So this is the kind of the paradox that I would like to try to elaborate and discuss today. Now, what's positive? As I pointed out, there are two dimensions of the global economy where things are going the right direction. One is more cyclical, the other is more structural, long-term. On the cyclical side, we are now in a period of a global expansion. And by global expansion, I mean a period of time where growth is not just positive, but is accelerating. And that's good news because since the global financial crisis, the global economy has been defined as being the new normal, the new mediocre, the new abnormal, in a secular stagnation because growth was in advanced economies anemic, subpar, below trend. And the economies of most advanced economies were going from periods of time of a slowdown, positive growth that was becoming slower, to periods of time of a mild expansion, but only mild. For the last 2 years, instead, we have seen an expansion that has become stronger with growth accelerating. We've seen it in the United States, we've seen it in Europe and the Eurozone, we've seen it in Japan and other advanced economies. But we're also seeing the same expansion in most important emerging market economies. Emerging market had a soft patch between 2013 and 2016 when there were a bunch of global headwinds, the slowdown of China, the taper tantrum by the Fed, the end of the commodity supercycle. And during that period of time, there was a slowdown of growth, say, among the BRICS, in Brazil, in Russia, in India, in China, in South Africa. Instead, the latest economic data suggests that China growth is stabilizing, that growth in India is accelerating, that even economies that were in recession like Brazil and Russia, they're now recovering. And I was just recently in South Africa where recent political changes suggest that maybe there will be an acceleration of economic growth as well. So good news is that global growth is becoming stronger. At the same time, actually, in advanced economies, while growth is stronger, inflation remains still very mild. We have not seen a very severe increase in inflation like the one we'd expect if there is a strong economic growth. And that combination of stronger growth and still low inflation implied that the process of exit from unconventional monetary policies by central banks in advanced economies has been gradual. Even the Fed is exiting zero policy rates, but slowly, and we're still in unconventional monetary policies in the Eurozone, in Japan, and many other advanced economies. So this combination of stronger growth, lower inflation, still easy monetary policy implies that volatility, at least until recently, had been low, and investors were actually in a positive animal spirit. So risk was on rather than off until recently for the last couple of years, and that risk-on mode with strong economic fundamentals had led to rising price of a variety of risky assets, starting with US and global equities. There's been volatility in the last couple of months, and I'm going to discuss it, but for the last 2 years has been stronger growth, lower volatility, and rising asset prices. And that has been good for advanced economies, has been good also for emerging markets. If anything, in the last few months, money was flowing towards Europe, towards other emerging markets. So we are, from a cyclical point of view, in a good period of time for the global economy. There are also structural and long-term forces that are positive about the global economy. Trade and globalization had implied that for the last few decades, hundreds of millions, if not billions, of folks in emerging markets have gotten out of poverty and have a better economic future. You see it in China, you see it in India, in Asia, and many other emerging markets. The second important trend is that rise of the power, economic, trading, and financial of emerging markets. A larger share of global economic activity and of global growth is coming from emerging markets. Until 10, 20 years ago, there were two major poles or engines of global growth, United States and Europe. Now, emerging markets, starting with China and India, are going to be another major engine of global economic growth. And that's going to be positive for having a more balanced global economic activity. And the third positive trend about the global economy is that there are new technologies and industries of the future that have the possibility of changing completely, radically, the way we live and work and increasing growth and productivity. You have IT, information technologies, anything from artificial intelligence, machine learning, the use of big data, Internet of Things that's going to increase productivity. You have BT, biotechnologies, and all the changes by medical research are going to make us live healthier and longer. You have ET, energy technologies, cheaper and cleaner energy, and the possibility that the price of many energies are renewable is going to fall. We have AT, agricultural technologies, with the lower cost of energy, we'll be able to also have lower cost of water and be able to increase significantly agricultural productivity. We have TT, transportation technologies. In a few years, driverless cars and trucks are going to become standard, and electric vehicles are going to become standard, making transportation cleaner and more efficient. We have MT, manufacturing technologies like robotic automation, they're going to increase productivity. And we have FT, financial technology or fintech, and the revolution is occurring in payment system, asset management, insurance, and credit allocation. So in many ways, this has been the best of all times, and sometimes as we face short-term economic problems, we forget how the world for the last 50, 60 years has changed for the better. An economic historian, Yuval Harari, who wrote the book Sapiens, says we'll no longer have war among major powers. Today, more people die of suicide than from war and terrorism. We no longer have mass hunger and starvation in most of the world, and today more people die of obesity than die from hunger, famines, and starvation. And today we don't have any major plagues or infectious diseases that used to kill millions of people. Today more people die of old age than from plagues and infectious diseases. And this improvement of the lot of billions of people is certainly something positive. And thanks to the new technologies of the future, the improvement of the welfare of a lot of part of humanity is going to get better over time. So these are the positive, both cyclical and also structural long-term. However, let's think about the kind of things can go wrong and what are the things we have to address. We had 2 quiet years for financial markets. From the beginning of, or the middle of 2016 until recently, risk was on. You had positive animal spirits and asset prices in advanced economies and emerging markets were going higher and higher, US and global equities, and not just the US, also emerging markets. Your own stock market in India reached new highs with higher price-earning ratios. However, for the last 2 months, we've had a significant rise of volatility in a number of global financial markets. The volatility started in February, and now we have another bout of volatility in the last week, 10 days. In February, the market concerns were those of a potential rise of inflation in the United States. This inflation risking to lead to an economy that was overheating and forcing the Fed to tighten faster and sooner. And let's notice the following point. This is the first time in 10 years that markets are starting to worry about rising inflation rather than lowflation or deflation. We had many episodes of risk off, 10 of them between 2010 and 2016, but these 10 episodes were all associated with markets' worries about lowflation or deflation or recession. And 6 of these 10 episodes led to a global market correction where US and global equity fell more than 10%. This time around is the first time in a decade that we have to start to worry about maybe inflation rearing its ugly head and leading to severe economic consequences. So that's a concern that has to be discussed. This was in February. In the last 10 days, instead, the rise in volatility led to a market correction in US and global equity has been driven by other types of concerns. One concern is, of course, the one of a risk of a trade war between the United States and China. And the second one has been this recent correction in the valuation of tech stocks, given rising concerns about privacy issues and related issues having to do with the role of these technological giants in the global economy. Now, the risk of trade war is more of a canary in a coal mine because it's a signal of a much broader concern that is the rising populist backlash against globalization. For the last few years, we've seen in many advanced economies, also emerging markets, this backlash. There has been a rise in inequality. There has been a concern that globalization, trade, migration, supranational authorities are leading to winners but also to losers. If you own capital, if you're a highly skilled worker in US, in Europe, and Japan, advanced economies, you win from globalization. But trade, migration, globalization, and even technology leads to some being left behind. Those who have low skills, those that are blue-collar workers with low skills, but increasingly technology implies that even white-collar jobs are being threatened. So there's a divide between the winners and the losers, between those who succeed and those that actually are left behind. And it's led actually not just a populist backlash against globalization, but also a threat to the global liberal economic order and a threat also to liberal democracy. We don't just have Trump in the United States or Brexit in UK, but you have extreme populist parties of the right and the left that are becoming more noisy in Europe, in places like Italy, like France, in Hungary and Poland. And this rise of strong men that are authoritarian, who are challenging liberal democracy, is not just a phenomenon that is occurring in advanced economies. You have Putin in Russia, you have Erdogan in Turkey, you have Kaczynski in Poland, you have Orban in Hungary, you have Duterte in the Philippines, you have Maduro in Venezuela. You have a bunch of strong men who are against economic reform, that are economic nationalists and populists, and they are not in favor of liberal democracy. So that's a challenge and the risk to the global economy, something that we have to worry about. So let's think about what are these risks, short-term, medium, long-term, and what could be done about it. First observation, if there are going to be global systemic economic risk, They have to come from economies that are large enough to affect the global economy. If an economy like Russia or Brazil gets in trouble, it might have an important consequences for that country, maybe also for a region like Latin America for Brazil, but it's not going to have a global systemic risk. To have a risk of a global economic stall or recession or financial crisis, trouble has to come from major and key economies in the world like United States, Europe and the Eurozone, or China. And if you think about the United States, on one side, there is strengthening of the economy, but as I pointed out, there's a concern that maybe the economy might have a significant rise in inflation. What is this concern coming from? It's coming from the fact that the US is close to full employment. Unemployment rate is around 4%. There's not much slack in labor markets, in goods market. And it's the first time that the US, without being in a recession or in a war, has done a massive fiscal stimulus in peacetime and in an economy that is in an expansion. 2% of GDP between tax cuts and increasing spending this year and next year. And there is a rising concern that this fiscal stimulus is leading to an overheating of the economy. There is a full employment, and that might lead to an acceleration of inflation. And if that acceleration of inflation were to occur, the Federal Reserve will have to hike interest rates faster and sooner than the market are now expecting. Some people say that the Fed is going to hike 4 times this year and 4 times next year, much more than the Fed is signaling today and the market is expecting. If this acceleration of inflation were to occur, that's going to be a worry because there'll be a tightening in financial conditions. Short-term interest rates will be higher, long-term interest rates will be higher, credit spreads will be higher, the stock market is going to more than correct, the dollar is going to strengthen, or that tightening financial condition could lead to a stall of US economic growth and lead potentially even to something worse than that and affect negatively, of course, global economic growth. Now, one view is that we are at full employment and acceleration of inflation is going to occur, but there is the opposite view that says that this acceleration of inflation is not going to be occurring. Some people say that especially when you look at traded goods prices, they depend more on global factors. And these global factors imply that traded good inflation is going to remain relatively low and mild in the United States and advanced economies. You have phenomena like globalization, like trade, like migration, like the weak power of labor and unions, technological innovations that are reducing the price of many goods and services, and this Amazon effect where Amazon is putting traditional retailer under competitive pressure and limits their pricing power. So one extreme view says we're going to be on the verge of a significant acceleration of inflation. The other one says no, the forces of globalization are going to keep inflation lower than otherwise. The honest answer is we don't know which one of these two views is going to be correct. This year is going to be the key year where we'll see whether that strong acceleration of inflation in the US is going to occur or not. If it does occur, that's going to imply economic and financial stresses. If it doesn't occur because global forces are more important in driving inflation than domestic slack of the economy, then we're going to remain in a period of stronger economic growth and mild and contained inflation. Now, when we look at the United States, the risk coming from the US and the Trump administration have not just to do with the concerns about an excessive fiscal stimulus that's going to lead to an overheating, cause higher inflation, and force the Fed to hike sooner and more than otherwise. There are other concerns that are in investors' mind. One is the concern about protectionists. This president was elected on a platform of Buy American, High American, of America First and Make America Great Again. And this is a president that doesn't believe in multilateralism, believes in unilateral action by the United States, doesn't believe in the global economic order, is essentially skeptical of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the UN, of the WTO, and is skeptical of the global liberal economic and political system that was actually created by the US and its allies after World War II. So this is fraying of the multilateralism in the global economy. And protectionism in trade, but also protectionism in foreign direct investment is one of the signals. The other way in which the US is becoming inward-looking is in its policy towards migration. These migration restrictions may slow down potential growth, because in an economy like the US, there's aging. Letting less people in implies that potential growth is going to slow down. So both the trade policies, the migration policies, and the fiscal policy of the administration might slow down potential growth. And of course, there is a wide range of geopolitical risk. And the president, if he feels weaker domestically, might try to find a foreign adventure or a foreign real or perceived threat as a way of distracting attention from domestic political weakness. You could have a confrontation with North Korea, with Iran, an escalation of trade wars with China, and as I said, dismantling the liberal economic order. So that's one thing that you have to keep in mind. The other points that I think are important is to try to understand the roles of emerging market economies in the global economy. As I pointed out, the trend is one in which emerging markets are going to be a larger share of global GDP and global economic growth, countries like China, India, and many other ones. If you look for the last 15 years or so, emerging markets have gone through various cycles. The period between 2003 and 2013 was a golden era for emerging markets, because you had a number of global tailwinds that were supporting emerging markets. You had China growing almost 10%. You had a commodity super cycle that was helping those emerging markets that are commodity exporters. And after the global financial crisis, zero policy rates or negative policy rates and quantitative easing in US, Europe, Japan, and other advanced economies implied a wall of liquidity that was searching for yield. And since the yield in emerging market was higher, money was flowing in many emerging market economies, strengthening their economies and their asset markets. That party was over, or started to be over in 2013, where the global tailwinds became headwinds. China started to slow down from 10% towards 6%. There was a taper tantrum when the Fed essentially said, we're over with quantitative easing, we're going to start raising policy rates from zero. And there was the end of the commodity super cycle. And this was a shock for emerging markets. And of course, a number of emerging markets that had loose monetary, fiscal, and credit policy in the boom years started to have financial pressures. People refer to the fragile five, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, and South Africa as among the emerging markets that during that period of time were fragile. Luckily, those financial pressures led to policy adjustment, macroeconomic adjustment, more financial reforms of one sort or another, and structural reform that stabilized this economy. So while there were wobbles in emerging markets, none of these emerging markets went into an outright financial crisis. However, risks remain, and of course, the big elephant in the room in terms of emerging market is China. China, in the last few years, has realized that this growth model is unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. It has to rebalance. It has to reduce leverage, reduce excess capacity, deal with bad assets, bad debts. But then, until this year, in spite of the policy pronunciation about rebalancing, political imperative, and this past year, the existence of the party Congress implied that growth and stability was trumping the need for rebalancing, implied that every time that China was slowing down, there was a new round of credit fuel fixed investment that implied more leverage, more overcapacity, more bad assets, more bad debts. And this financial fragility have been increasing. Now that the party Congress is over, now that President Xi Jinping has changed the constitution and is going to be able to stay in power more than 10 years, China has a chance to do what's right and reduce its financial imbalances as a way of avoiding a financial crisis and a hard landing. If China does it, then it can stabilize this economy, but we don't know yet, and I was just, until a few days ago in Beijing, whether they'll be more aggressive in now front-loading the kind of economic reform that reduces this kind of a financial risk. My observation about India is that India has a bright long-term economic future, but as maybe I'll be able to discuss with Subramanian during our fireside in a moment, India has to do more economic reform and more macro stabilization to be able to increase its potential growth well above 7% to 8, 9. And a country like India that has to absorb a young population into the labor force has to grow faster than 7% to achieve its own goal. I'll make some final observation about some of the long-term potential risk. As I pointed out, demography matters, and biotech is going to imply we can all live longer and healthier. But if you're in advanced economies, can we afford to live until we are not only in our 80s, 90s, but even more so, when you have massive unfunded fiscal liabilities, like unfunded social security system or medical provision of healthcare that is becoming expensive. In emerging markets, it's great that there is strong population growth and you have the demographic dividend, but as the Middle East suggests, unless your workers have the skills, the education, they get training, and they have the economic opportunity, eventually young folks who are restless, who don't have a lot of job opportunity, cause social instability and political instability. And we saw it with the Arab Spring. So it's great to have a demographic dividend, but then you have to put it at work. We still also live in a world in which we have high debts, private and public, both in advanced economies and emerging markets. We live in a world in which unconventional monetary policy have led to asset reflation, if not inflation, and the risk of frothiness in a variety of asset and credit markets is important. And as central banks take away the liquidity because they're now normalizing policy rates, there may be headwinds for asset prices. We live also in a world in which, as I pointed out, there's a nexus between the rise in inequality, the populist backlash against globalization, the rise of protectionism, and the fact that even more than trade and migration, technological innovation is going to disrupt jobs, incomes, industries significantly. And we also live finally in a world in which there is a number of geopolitical risks that are looming over the horizon, and we live in a world in which there is more economic and financial interdependence, and therefore we need global solution to global economic and financial problems, but policies are becoming more national, if not more nationalistic. The G7 became the G20, but the world in some dimension looks like a G0 world, where no power can impose its will on the world because we have rising global powers, whether it's US, Europe, India, China, and others, but we don't have global public goods, and there is no global governance the way it's needed for the global economy. So we live in a world that is more interdependent, where either we swim together or we sink together. We need global governance, but the institution of those global governance are being challenged by the backlash against globalization, nationalism, and protectionism. And that's a risk that is one that we have to consider, address, and try to counter. Thank you very much.